Democritus was a Greek philosopher who lived about 460 to 370 BC. He came up with his atomic theory around 400 BC, and he's often known as the laughing philosopher. He was known this because he had a happy spirit, and sometimes he also liked to make fun of his other philosophers. He preferred studying nature over wealth, and he could have been very wealthy, and he was considered also very competitive according to Aristotle. Democritus didn't do any physical experiments. He did thought experiments instead. At the time, there were some ideas that said that change was actually impossible without something coming from nothing. So if you got something new, the only way you could have gotten something new was it came from nothing. Democritus said this was not true. He said that change was instead due to indivisible particles called atoms, or we call atoms, that could combine and recombine, and it was this recombination that made new things. One of his phrases said, "Nothing exists except atoms and empty space. Everything else is opinion." So what is Democritus' atomic theory? Well, he came up with the idea that atoms are indivisible and indestructible. He also thought that they come in many shapes and sizes that relate to the property. So iron atoms would be very strong and solid, water atoms would be smooth and slippery, and air atoms would be light and whirling. So atoms had different shapes and textures, and they had to combine and recombine so you would get new things. And how did they do that? They did that because they had hooks and eyes or balls and sockets, unlike the picture here. This YouTube video is by Carl Sagan, a famous scientist who talks about Democritus.
A restaurant like this, you told a story about someone from Abdera, you were guaranteed a laugh. It was, in a way, the Brooklyn of its time. For Democritus, all of life was to be enjoyed and understood. In fact, for him, understanding and enjoyment were pretty much the same thing. He said, "A life without festivity is a long road without an inn." Democritus may have come from Abdera, but he was no dummy. Democritus understood that the complex forms, changes, and motions of the material world all derive from the interaction of very simple moving parts. He called these parts atoms. All material objects are collections of atoms, intricately assembled, even we. When I cut this apple, the knife must be passing through empty spaces between the atoms, Democritus argued. If there were no such empty spaces, no void, then the knife would encounter some impenetrable atom, and the apple wouldn't be cut. Let's compare the cross-sections of the two pieces. Are the exposed areas exactly equal? No, said Democritus. The curvature of the apple forces this slice to be slightly shorter than the rest of the apple. If they were equally tall, then we'd have a cylinder and not an apple. No matter how sharp the knife, these two pieces have unequal cross-sections. But why? Because on the scale of the very small, matter exhibits some irreducible roughness. And this fine scale of roughness, Democritus of Abdera identified with the world of the atoms. His arguments are not those we use today, but they're elegant and subtle and derived from everyday experience. And his conclusions were fundamentally right. Democritus believed that nothing happens at random, that everything has a material cause. He said, "I would rather understand one cause than be king of Persia." He believed that poverty in a democracy was far better than wealth in a tyranny. He believed that the prevailing religions of his time were evil, and that neither souls nor immortal gods existed. There is no evidence that Democritus was persecuted for his beliefs, but then again, he came from Abdera. However, in his time, the tradition of tolerance for unconventional views was beginning to erode. For instance, the prevailing belief was that the moon and the sun were gods. Another contemporary of Democritus, named Anaxagoras, taught that the moon was a place made of ordinary matter, and that the sun was a red-hot stone far away in the sky. For this, Anaxagoras was condemned, convicted, and imprisoned for impiety, a religious crime. People began to be persecuted for their ideas. A portrait of Democritus is now on the Greek 100 drachma note. But his ideas were suppressed and his influence on history made minor. The mystics were beginning to win.